In the orderly, God-fearing towns of the Holy Roman Empire, circa 1550–1650, the domestic sphere was the bedrock of social and spiritual stability. A wife's fidelity was not a private matter but a public covenant, a pillar upholding the household, the community, and the divine order itself. Its breach was not merely a betrayal of a husband. It was an act of sedition against the hierarchy ordained by God and enforced by man. The primary institution tasked with policing this boundary was not the distant crown, but the local civic court, acting in concert with the moral authority of the Lutheran or Reformed Church. These courts were assemblies of respected burghers, guild masters, and elders, men whose power was rooted in property, piety, and the perceived integrity of their own households. The process began not with a dramatic arrest, but with a stain upon the air, a rumor. Gossip, once it reached a certain critical mass and source credibility, transformed into formal suspicion. A husband, finding his honor publicly questioned, his lineage threatened, had little choice but to petition the magistrates. The accusation was often delivered in writing, a dry, legalistic document that belied the cataclysm it triggered. It spoke of notorious fame, of violated marital duty, of actions causing scandal to the community and offense to God. The language was cold, removing the flesh-and-blood woman and replacing her with a legal and moral problem to be solved. Upon receipt, the court would summon the accused wife. This was not a trial in the modern sense, but an inquisitory proceeding. The goal was not to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but to investigate the truth of the public rumor and extract a confession, the cornerstone of the judicial process. The initial interrogation was a calibrated assault on circumstance. Where was she when her husband was at the market? Who was seen speaking to her at the well? Why was a certain window shutter unlatched? The questions constructed a cage of mundane details. Her demeanor was evidence. Downcast eyes could signify guilt or virtue. A defensive tone was proof of a shrewish nature. Tears could be read as repentance or manipulation. Concurrently, the magistrates would depose witnesses. Neighbors, servants, even children were questioned. The testimony was a tapestry of partial views and inferred meanings, a glimpse of a figure in a doorway, a fragment of overheard conversation, the timing of a candle's light in an upper room. The court scribe would record it all in a steady hand, translating lived moments into immutable accusatory text. Social standing weighed heavily. The word of a guild master outweighed that of a milkmaid. The testimony of the accused wife held the least weight of all. If this web of circumstantial evidence tightened sufficiently, the court would move to secure the wife's person. This was not imprisonment for punishment, but for custody, to prevent flight, to isolate her from potential co-conspirators, real or imagined, and to apply the pressure of solitude. She would be placed in the town's detention room, often a damp, stone-walled cellar adjacent to the town hall or within the gatehouse. It was a space of profound sensory deprivation, dark, cold, separated from the rhythms of the town and the life of her household. Here she was left with the enormity of her situation and the growing certainty of the court's belief in her guilt. The purpose of Part 1 was complete. The accusation had been formalized. The legal machinery, slow and deliberate, had engaged. The wife existed now in a liminal state, not yet condemned but severed from her former life. The community knew. The record was being written. The stage was set for the next phase, where implication would demand confirmation, and the court would employ more direct methods to unveil the truth it already believed resided within her. With the accused wife sequestered, the civic court shifted from investigation to a process of truth extraction. The presumption of guilt, solidified by rumor and circumstantial evidence, now required a foundation in confession. This phase was characterized by a chilling bureaucratic rationality, where psychological pressure and judicial coercion were systematized into standard procedure. The institution's power was manifested not in rage, but in an implacable, patient insistence. The primary tool was the return to interrogation, now under altered conditions. The questioning moved from the public chamber to a more private room, often within the same municipal complex holding her cell. The atmosphere was deliberately intensified. She would be brought before a reduced panel of magistrates, their faces severe in the dim light. The questions became repetitive, circular, and laden with the weight of the witness statements already collected. They would present her with alleged facts as immutable truths. It is attested by 3 reliable persons that you were seen at the window after curfew. Explain this. The methodology was to confront her with a version of events so concrete and officially endorsed that denial seemed not just futile, but a further insult to the court's authority. Simultaneously, the court often deployed the threat of the painful question, die peinliche Frage. This was the formal legal term for judicial torture, permitted under the the Imperial Criminal Code of 1532, when indicia, strong circumstantial evidence existed and the crime was grave. The threat itself was a potent psychological device. The magistrates would calmly describe the instruments available in the tower or dungeon: the thumbscrews, the leg screws, the rack. They were not described as instruments of punishment, but of clarification, a means to help the stubborn overcome their lying tongues and assist the court in reaching a righteous verdict. The objective was to make the prospect of physical suffering so immediate and inevitable that the verbal path of confession appeared the only rational escape. In many jurisdictions, a secondary, more insidious form of pressure was applied: the intervention of the clergy. A pastor or deacon would be sent to her cell. His mission was not to offer solace, but to exhort her to confess for the good of her immortal soul. He framed her resistance as a spiritual danger, a hardening of the heart against God's forgiveness. He would speak of the hellfire that awaited the unrepentant sinner, contrasting it with the mercy that could follow a full admission of guilt. This merged secular and eternal terror, positioning the court's demand for confession as a divine imperative. If these pressures, isolation, relentless questioning, the explicit threat of torture and spiritual coercion, succeeded, the confession would be meticulously recorded. Every detail demanded by the court was inscribed: times, places, acts. The scribe's pen would transform the coerced admission into a dry, chronological narrative of transgression. Once signed or marked by the accused, this document became the centerpiece of the case. It retroactively justified all prior measures and dictated the inevitable sentence. However, if the wife maintained her innocence despite the threats, the court faced a procedural threshold. To proceed to actual torture required a formal vote and specific legal justification based on the strength of the indicia. If granted, the executioner, a municipal officer distinct from the judges, would be summoned. The torture session was ritualized, witnessed by the magistrates and a court physician, whose role was to ensure the subject did not die prematurely. It was incremental, beginning with the least severe devices, with questions repeated between applications. The goal remained a confession, now to be extracted through physical agony rather than the fear of it. This entire system, from the threat to the act, was meticulously documented. The court records noted the indicia, the vote to apply peinliche Frage, the instruments used, the responses given. This paperwork created a veneer of legality and order around a process designed to break human will. The institution protected itself through transcription, ensuring every act of coercion was framed as a necessary step in the pursuit of judicial and divine truth. The wife was no longer a person, but a subject in a grim experiment conducted by civic authority, her body and mind the terrain upon which the community's boundaries were violently reaffirmed. A confession, whether born of terror, agony, or strategic capitulation, rendered the verdict a foregone conclusion. The civic court's function now transitioned from truth-finding to sentence enforcement and social restoration. The punishment for a convicted adulteress was not merely penal, it was didactic, a public performance designed to cleanse the community of her transgression and reaffirm the inviolable hierarchy she had challenged. The most common sentence, outside of extreme cases involving noble blood or additional crimes, was not death, but ritualized humiliation and permanent exile. The sentence was pronounced in a full session of the court. The language was formal, invoking the disturbance of the peace, the violation of God's commandment, and the injury done to her husband's honor. The prescribed punishment was often the Strafe des Stoppenschlags und der Stadtverweisung, punishment of the rod and banishment from the town. Following the pronouncement, the wife was immediately remanded to the executioner for the corporal component. The executioner, the same officer who may have administered torture, now performed his public role. The punishment was typically carried out at a central civic location, the pillory in the market square or the steps of the town hall. The wife would be stripped to her shift, her hair sometimes shorn. She was then bound to the pillory or a post. The executioner would administer a specific number of lashes with a birch rod or a whip. This was not a frenzied beating, but a measured, ritualized application of pain. The number of strokes was decreed by the court: 12, 25, 30, the tally itself a reflection of the perceived severity of the offense. The assembled townsfolk were silent witnesses, their presence a crucial element of the sanction. The spectacle was not entertainment, but a solemn civic duty. Each stroke served as an audible, physical punctuation mark to the court's authority, searing the lesson of obedience onto her skin and into the collective memory of the onlookers. Following the whipping, the sentence of banishment was enacted. Often still bearing the visible marks of the rod, she would be formally escorted to one of the town gates. The magistrates or their bailiffs would be present. At the threshold, the literal boundary of the community's legal and spiritual jurisdiction, she was declared vogelfrei, free as a bird, but meaning outside all protection of law. The gates would be shut behind her. Her property, if any, was forfeit to her husband or the court. Her marriage was legally dissolved. She ceased to exist within the social and legal fabric of the town. The aftermath was an exercise in erasure. Her name was struck from civic rolls and parish registers as if she had died. In the household of her former husband, her possessions were removed, her presence scrubbed from daily life. He was free to remarry, his honor publicly restored by the court's violent intervention. The children, if any, remained with him, their mother becoming a forbidden subject, a ghost referenced only in whispers or as a cautionary tale. The only enduring trace of her existence within the official sphere was the case file. The bundle of parchments or papers, the initial petition, witness depositions, the confession, the sentence, was tied with cord, annotated with the case number, and shelved in the municipal archive. It sat among records of tax disputes, property transfers, and guild regulations. Here, the entire narrative of rumor, fear, coercion, and pain was reduced to a neat calligraphic summary. The file's tone was dispassionate, devoid of screams, tears, or the scent of the dungeon. It spoke only of procedures followed, indicia evaluated, and judgments rendered. This is the legacy that echoes. Not the dramatic pyres of witches, but the quiet, efficient machinery of a civic court protecting a social order. The legacy lives in the archive's dust, in the cold procedural language that masks human rupture, in the thousands of women who simply vanished from their town's history, expelled through the gate with the marks of the rod upon them. Their stories have no closure, no redemption arc. There is only the silent gate, the impeccable record, and the unsettling understanding that the most potent systems of control are often those that operate under the clear, cold light of the law, documenting their own violence in perfect, permanent script.